He was told he would be playing a god. They handed him lines to memorize, a gilded breastplate, and a wooden sword painted to look like bronze. What nobody told him was how the story ended. In every version of this myth, the god dies. And in this arena, the myth was real. Centuries later, archaeologists pulled something from a drainage channel beneath the Colosseum's wooden floor. A bone fragment covered in marks that matched no catalogued Roman weapon and no known predator's teeth. A forensic team mentioned it in a footnote. Nobody followed up. The gates opened. Light hit him like a wall, and with it came the smell. Old blood baked into sand by a full day of sun. Behind a secondary gate, something massive shifted in the dark. One of the handlers stepped back. He wouldn't make eye contact. What happened next was not an execution. It wasn't sport. Rome had a word for it, but Romans themselves stopped using that word within a generation because some spectacles were designed to happen once and never be written down. If you're still with me, stay close, because to understand what this man walked into and why 50,000 citizens laughed instead of looking away, we have to go back, not to the beginning of the games. We go back to the lie that started them. We go where the textbooks stop. Here is the version you were taught. In 264 BC, in a cattle market that smelled of dung and smoke, the sons of Decimus Junius Brutus Scaever buried their father with blood. 3 pairs of slaves, armed and told to fight until one of each pair stopped moving. The Romans called this munus, a duty owed to the dead, borrowed from the Campanians and Samnites, and absorbed into Rome the way Rome absorbed everything it touched. From there, the story writes itself. Grief became tradition. Tradition became spectacle. Spectacle became state policy. By the time the Colosseum opened in 80 AD, death was Rome's most reliable public institution. A clean arc, from piety to bloodlust, fits neatly into a chapter heading. And that is exactly the problem, because clean stories in Roman history almost always mean someone edited them. Livy records that the funeral games of 264 BC drew a crowd far too large for a private ceremony. The Forum Boiarium was a cattle market. No seating, no stage, yet thousands appeared, as if they already knew what was coming, as if this was not the first time blood had been spilled for an audience in Rome. Just the first time anyone wrote it down. And one more detail. The Brutus family's funeral archives were among the first Roman documents to be selectively revised by later historians. Small changes, dates adjusted, names removed, the kind of edits that only matter if someone is controlling a narrative before it's finished. Most people stop asking questions here. That is why history keeps lying to them. But the lie isn't in the dates, it's in the motive. Because the textbook version says Rome stumbled into arena violence. What if it didn't stumble at all? By the 3rd century BC, the Senate had a problem that legions couldn't solve. Rome's population was outgrowing its capacity to feed, employ, or contain. Veterans came home from wars, expecting land that no longer existed. The urban poor were packed into apartment blocks that collapsed so often. The city kept permanent rubble-clearing crews on salary. The Senate didn't stumble into blood sports. They architected it. The Ludi Romani, religious festivals for Jupiter, were retrofitted with gladiators, not because crowds demanded it, but because the Senate needed a ritual that made obedience feel voluntary. And at the center of it all, men killed each other, wearing the armor of Rome's conquered enemies. The Samnite with his heavy shield, the Thracian with his curved blade. Every fighter was a political statement, and every time one fell, the crowd was rehearsing Rome's supremacy. The arena was a loyalty oath performed in blood. Picture the experience from the stands. You arrive at dawn, the air is cool, tinged with the smell of animals drifting up from below. Vendors push through the rows, selling olives, bread, wine at twice the price. Children run between seats. By every measurable standard, it is a day out. 15 feet beneath you, separated by stone and sand, a man in painted armor is learning that the animals were never trained, that the wooden sword will not be replaced, and that the second act he was promised does not exist. He can hear your laughter through the floor. This is no longer about what happened. It is about why it was allowed, and the answer is worse than cruelty. The answer is that nobody in those stands believed they were doing anything wrong. The system was designed so that participation felt like patriotism. The violence was not hidden. It was celebrated. That is not a society losing control. That is a society functioning exactly as intended. When Emperor Titus opened the Colosseum in 80 AD, the inaugural festival ran for 100 days. Ancient sources claim 9,000 animals were killed. The number appears in multiple accounts. Historians repeat it faithfully. Nobody stops to do the math. The Colosseum's hypogeum could hold roughly 200 animals at capacity. 9,000 animals across 100 days means constant resupply. Caravans arriving before dawn. Ships docking with caged beasts from 3 continents. An entire logistics operation running invisibly beneath the spectacle. The games were not events. They were supply chains. Pliny the Elder noted that animals common in certain regions a generation earlier were becoming impossible to find. North African lions, Atlas, bears, hippopotamuses from the Upper Nile. He treated this as a curiosity. Modern biologists recognize the signature of systematic ecological collapse driven by a single consumer. The arena didn't just kill animals. It emptied entire landscapes, and the scarcity was useful. Every year, the beasts grew rarer. Every year, the cost rose. Only the wealthiest could afford to stage hunts. Extinction was profitable, but the animals were only the visible cost. The same supply chain that moved 10,000 beasts also moved people, prisoners, condemned men and women, catalogued and transported with the same precision as the lions they would eventually face. And if you're finding value in what we're covering here, hit like and subscribe so this channel can keep going deeper into the stories that official history leaves out. What happened to those people underground is something Rome worked hard to ensure nobody ever wrote down. The gladiatorial system was not what most people imagine. It was a regulated industry. Training schools called ludi operated across the empire. The largest, the Ludus Magnus in Rome, connected directly to the Colosseum through an underground tunnel. Inside, gladiators followed strict dietary regimens. Physicians developed surgical techniques on arena fighters. Decades before those methods reached civilian medicine, bone fragments from gladiatorial barracks at Ephesus show evidence of advanced cranial surgery. The same empire that engineered elaborate systems for killing these men invested heavily in keeping them alive. Not out of compassion. Accounting. A trained gladiator was worth more than a Roman house. The care was real. The motive was profit. And the profit depended entirely on these men being healthy enough to die spectacularly when their number was called. But not every fighter was an investment. The system created a category called the noxai, the and demned no training, no real armor, no chance. Prisoners, deserters, people captured in the wrong war, handed wooden shields and blunted swords, and placed opposite trained killers or starved animals. The system needed them, not as fighters, but as contrast. Their terror made the gladiators' courage readable. Their helplessness made the crowd's cheers feel earned. Manufactured victims built into the architecture of the spectacle as deliberately as the trapdoors beneath the sand. And then there were the gladiatrices, female fighters. Roman literary sources mentioned them with open contempt. Juvenal mocked them. Domitian staged fights between women and dwarfs as novelties. The written record treats them as jokes. The physical evidence says something entirely different. A gladiatrix burial in Southwark, London, with grave goods consistent with a professional fighter. A marble relief from Halicarnassus depicting two women, Amazon and Achillea, in full gladiatorial equipment. Not costumes, professional gear. The literary sources laughed at them. The archaeology says they were common. Someone was lying. And when you find the gap between what Rome wrote and what Rome actually did, you have found where the real story hides. Everything covered so far is what Rome was willing to put on record. What comes next is what they tried to erase. The morning belonged to animal hunts, the afternoon to gladiators, but the midday slot, when casual spectators left for lunch, belonged to something the schedule listed, but the histories rarely describe. Damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. The midday executions were not filler. They were the main event for a different audience. The senators and elites who stayed through the heat were watching a curated catalogue of consequences organized by crime, deserters mauled by wolves. Forgers had their hands destroyed before the animals were released. Arsonists burned. Each death was a category. Each category was a warning aimed not at the poor in the upper tiers, but at the powerful sitting in the front rows, and the cruelty demanded artistry. The condemned didn't simply die. They died in side stories. A man convicted of arson was cast as Hercules, dressed in the tunica molesta, a shirt soaked in pitch and set ablaze, while a narrator described the myth of Hercules, consumed by the poisoned garment of Nessus. The fire was real. The screams were real. But the frame of the myth gave the audience permission to watch. He was no longer a person, he was a character, and characters are supposed to suffer. A thief was dressed as Orpheus, handed a lyre, and pushed into the arena with animals that had been starved for days. In the myth, wild beasts sit in silent awe of the music. In the arena, the lyre played for 11 seconds. The poet Martial, who attended, noted that the bear was unimpressed. Seneca attended the midday executions once. He wrote that he left more cruel, more inhuman than when he entered. But the detail that matters is what he observed in the crowd around him. Educated, literate citizens sitting through systematic torture and registering nothing. Not excitement, not disgust, nothing. The arena had normalized the unthinkable so completely that cruelty no longer registered as unusual. It was simply the midday slot. Seneca only saw what happened above ground. What happened beneath the arena, in the hypogeum, in the corridors where prisoners waited while listening to the deaths before their own, that is what Rome tried hardest to remove from the record. The Colosseum's hypogeum was not a basement, it was a machine. 36 trapdoors, hand-cranked elevators lifting animals and people from darkness into light in seconds, corridors wide enough for 2 carts, drainage channels angled at precise gradient to move blood away from the surface fast enough to keep the schedule running. Recent excavations revealed what the literary sources never mention: graffiti scratched into tunnel walls by people who never came back out, tally marks, names, crude drawings of animals observed through cage bars. These were not the words of criminals. They were evidence left by people who had time to think about what was coming and who chose to prove that they had existed. Some waited hours, some waited days. They could hear the crowds above them, the beasts in adjacent cages, the mechanical grinding of elevators lifting the previous person into position. Every death before theirs was an audition for their own. The bone from the opening. Analysis showed the score marks were made in sequence. Animal teeth first, then a bladed metal instrument applied after death. Not a fight, not a feeding. Something staged, where an animal and a blade were used on the same body in that precise order. No Roman source describes this procedure. None. The most bureaucratic civilization in the ancient world documented shipping manifests, sewer schedules, grain inventories. The absence of this particular practice from the record is not an oversight. It is a decision. Here is what shifts when you see the full picture. For the last several minutes, this has been a story about Roman cruelty, an empire that turned death into entertainment. That framing feels natural because it is the framing Rome's own critics used. Seneca called it inhumanity. Tertullian called it demonic. But they all shared the same blind spot. They assumed the violence was a corruption of something better, that Rome had a moral baseline, and the arena fell below it. It didn't. The arena was not where Rome lost its humanity. The arena was where Rome demonstrated it had never intended to extend humanity to everyone in the first place. The Noxi, the prisoners, the slaves, they were not treated as people and then subjected to cruelty. They were classified as non-persons first. The cruelty was downstream of the classification. The games didn't brutalize Rome. Rome was already organized around the principle that certain lives existed to be used. The arena just made the using entertaining. Every section of this story shares one mechanism. Exclusion performed a spectacle. The arena's deepest function was drawing the line between human and non-human and making 50,000 people participate in drawing it. Every cheer was a vote. Every laugh was consent. Through that lens, the grandest spectacles stop looking like excess. They look like theology. When Caesar ordered a basin dug and filled with water for a mock naval battle in 46 BC, thousands of condemned men crewed the ships, fighting and drowning on real water, summoned inside a city. Caesar was not staging a fight. He was performing divinity, commanding an ocean where none had existed. Augustus built a basin requiring a dedicated aqueduct just to fill it. 30 warships, thousands of men, an artificial sea for a single afternoon of killing. When Claudius staged his Nomachia at Lake Fucino, the condemned called out the famous line, "Those about to die, salute you." Claudius called back, or not. The crowd interpreted it as mercy. The men began fighting with less intensity. Claudius was furious. He had meant it as a joke. The killing resumed. Under Nero, condemned Christians were dressed in the tunica molesta and set alight to illuminate garden parties. Their burning bodies served as lampposts while dinner guests strolled past. The person inside was no longer a person. They were fuel. The garment didn't just kill them, it reclassified them. The water drained, the fires went out, the sand was raked, but the administrative records, the supply logs, shipping money, fests, payrolls, prisoner inventories, those records existed. Rome documented everything, and almost none of that documentation survived. Not because it was lost, because it was destroyed. In the early 4th century AD, Constantine began restricting gladiatorial combat. The standard narrative frames this as moral progress. The reality was economic. The games had become too expensive for a shrinking empire. Constantine didn't abolish the arena because it was wrong. He defunded it because he could not afford it. But something else happened at the same time. Arena records began disappearing systematically. Christian emperors had their reasons. Detailed logs would have revealed which Christian communities negotiated with authorities about which members would be handed over for execution. Which bishops cooperated? The martyrology worked best as narrative, not as evidence. Senatorial families had their own reasons. The archives recorded which families had sponsored which games, how many deaths their generosity had funded. By the 5th century, those same families were repositioning themselves as Christian aristocrats. The arena records were receipts they could not afford to keep. The edited funeral records from the Brutus family. That was the template. Rome had been curating its own history since the Republic. The arena's administrative truth was simply the largest document ever erased, destroyed not by one party for one reason, but by multiple parties for competing reasons, which is precisely why the destruction was so thorough. Everyone had something to hide, and here is the irony that should disturb you most. Caligula, Nero, Commodus, remembered as monsters. But Trajan, the good emperor, celebrated his Dacian conquest with 123 days of games, thousands of deaths, 11,000 animals. Augustus staged the largest naval massacre in arena history. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, the man who wrote Meditations on Virtue, presided over games throughout his entire reign. The good emperors killed at exactly the same scale as the mad ones. The difference was never the body count. It was the branding. Cruelty was never the sin. Tastelessness was. Juvenal's bread and circuses is still quoted as a warning about distracted populations. But Juvenal was not warning anyone. He was mocking the poor for accepting entertainment instead of demanding political power. The line meant to be a diagnosis became a justification. And every government that has since used spectacle to manage its population has internalized Rome's lesson, not as a cautionary tale, as an operating manual. By the 5th century, the Colosseum was silent, amphitheaters crumbled, travertine was quarried to build churches. The same stones that once held prisoners were built into altars. But the silence was not peace. It was bankruptcy. The arena did not close because Rome found its conscience. It closed because Rome ran out of money. The cruelty was never rejected. It was defunded. 4 centuries of systematic public killing. And the only people who objected were philosophers nobody listened to, and the very people the empire had tried to feed to lions. Rome never said enough. Not once. 7 million people visit the Colosseum every year. They admire the engineering,